In the empire of Genghis Khan, the most terrifying privilege was an agonizing death. The higher your status as an enemy, the more sophisticated and personal the ritual of your destruction became. A common soldier on the battlefield faced the swift, impersonal strike of a sword. But for a noble captive, everything was different. According to the great Yasa, his blood was not to touch the earth. Therefore, he was either wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses, or, even more horrifyingly, executed in complete silence. The executioners, acting as methodically as butchers, would lay the ruler on the ground. With one sharp, calculated movement, they would break his spine, turning him into a limp doll. This was not sadism. This was a cold, systematic, and ritualistic machine of destruction, whose logic was more terrifying than any myth. This paradoxical logic gives rise to the first fundamental question. How could the Mongols, who executed a person for stealing a piece of meat, establish complete religious tolerance for conquered peoples, exempting their priests from all taxes? Where is the system in that? We will uncover the answer to this question of pragmatism versus sadism in the 5th section. The second question is even more unsettling. Why, after the Battle of the Kalka River, were the Rus princes, the elite of their people, slowly crushed to death under a feasting platform while the victors celebrated over their bodies? Meanwhile, common soldiers were granted a quick death. This seemingly sadistic execution is, in fact, the highest form of psychological warfare. We will dissect its mechanism in the 7th and final section. This is an investigation, not merely a list of horrors. You came here to hear about torture, but you will leave with an understanding of something far more disturbing. We will trace how the image of Genghis Khan the sadist, who reveled in suffering, crumbles to reveal the architect of a ruthless yet logical system. A system where every act of cruelty was not an end in itself, but a calculated tool for achieving global objectives. We are accustomed to seeing Genghis Khan's cruelty as a wildfire, elemental, chaotic, and irrational. But this investigation will show that it was more like a river carving a canyon, cold, methodical, and subject to the relentless laws of efficiency. Your journey into the heart of this system will follow a clear path. In just 4 minutes, we will expose their arsenal of psychological weapons and show how rumors and fear became more lethal than any sword. By the 10th minute, you will grasp the economic logic of death. We will look into the Mongols' accounting ledgers to see why mass executions were more profitable than elaborate tortures. And at the 19th minute, we will reach the climax. We will analyze the ritual execution without a single drop of blood, and you will understand why the symbolic annihilation of an enemy was more important to them than physical destruction. Their terror was so total that it led to the removal of 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere. This is comparable to halting all gasoline use on the entire planet for 2 years. But how could a single messenger with no army destroy an entire city? The mechanism of their first and primary weapon is hidden in this paradox. The messenger carried not a sword, but a story. The story of the fate of those who resisted. It was a virus of fear, and it worked not like an explosion, but like erosion. First, rumors, like small streams, washed away confidence. Then, the tales of refugees, like downpours, destroyed the will to fight. By the time the army arrived, the city's morale had already been eroded down to its stone foundation. This terror was so absolute that forests grew on the sites of annihilated civilizations. The Mongols fought not against armies, but against the very idea of resistance. And the effectiveness of this doctrine was sustained by demonstrative acts. The most famous of these was the Khwarezmian campaign. At first glance, it was an act of irrational revenge. In 1218, The governor of the city of Otrar executed Mongol envoys, and Genghis Khan seemingly spent years and vast resources on a personal vendetta. But this was not revenge. It was the most expensive and effective advertising campaign in history. Genghis Khan turned Khwarazm into a bloody press release that was distributed across the world. He burned one empire to buy dozens of others without a fight. And the detail that proves this is that he ordered not just the killing of people, but the methodical destruction of irrigation systems, turning flourishing oases into dead deserts. He was killing not the present, but the future. This cold economic logic also decided the fate of every prisoner. Fear was not just a rumor, it was physically palpable. The defenders of a besieged city first heard it. It was the screams of the Hashir, a human shield of captives taken from the previous city, driven towards the walls. Then they smelled it. An army of 100,000 soldiers and nearly 500,000 horses and livestock created an unbearable stench that the wind carried for miles. It was an olfactory marker of the approaching apocalypse. The Mongols attacked all the senses, but this system of total pressure was merely the tip of the iceberg, beneath which lay a ruthless economy of death. The main question a Mongol commander asked himself, looking at thousands of prisoners, was not how much will they pay for ransom. He asked, what is the net utility of this resource? People, walls, knowledge, everything was viewed through the lens of efficiency. A craftsman was an asset. An aristocrat capable of leading a rebellion was a liability. If the net utility of a resource was negative, it was written off. The order to kill everyone taller than a wagon's axle was not sadism, but a quick filter to eliminate able-bodied men. Their logic worked like a kitchen sieve. Valuable engineers and artisans were kept, while useless nobility was discarded. They were not bloodthirsty barbarians. They were ruthless accountants of death, and we are about to open their ledgers. The fate of millions was decided not on the battlefield, but in this ledger. A craftsman was an asset. An aristocrat was a toxic liability, subject to immediate liquidation. It seems paradoxical that the Mongols deliberately spared engineers, but almost always executed the nobility. Simple logic suggests that a craftsman is a living trophy that can be relocated to build cities. But the numbers shatter this picture. After the capture of Samarkand in 1220, Genghis Khan selected 30,000 artisans to work in Mongolia. The nobility, however, were not just people. They were nodes in a social network, centers of potential resistance. Keeping them captive required resources, and releasing them created risks. Therefore, their execution was not murder, but the surgical removal of future uprisings. A person's fate was decided not by their pleas, but by a line item in the empire's balance sheet. And this logic became even more merciless under the command of the brilliant general Subutai, for whom even this approach was too slow. It was a brutal marketplace where the value of human life was determined not by morality, but by utility. At first glance, it all seemed to depend on chance. Sometimes merchants were ransomed, sometimes everyone was killed. It appeared to be chaos, but Persian and Chinese chronicles describe a strict system for distributing spoils. An experienced siege engineer was worth more than a dozen peasants. A young woman was valued more highly than an elderly one. This was not chaos, but a cold market where the currency was utility. And in this system, torture was the act of damaging the goods. Why waste time tormenting an asset that could be used or sold? It was economically senseless. For a Mongol, torturing a useful captive was as foolish as deliberately breaking one's own arm before a hard day's work. This practice led directly to the creation of tactics that appeared sadistic on the surface, but were, in essence, the pinnacle of military cynicism. Subutai, Genghis Khan's greatest strategist, was not a sadist, but an effective manager of war. Prolonged torture for information was a senseless waste of time. He deliberately bypassed heavily fortified cities to destroy the enemy's army in the open field. Sieges, torture, and long negotiations were bad business for him, an unprofitable enterprise. Subutai, who was nearly 50 at the time of the Battle of the Kalka River, valued time more than cruel amusements. He preferred deception to brute force, making the enemy believe he was retreating only to deliver a fatal blow later. For him, cruelty was merely a tool he used when it yielded the maximum result with minimal cost. And this managerial approach turned people into expendable material for solving tactical problems. What do an accounting ledger and a city siege have in common? At first glance, nothing. But for the Mongols, both had columns for income and expenses. Any army protects its soldiers, but the Mongols took this to an absolute degree. Their warrior was not just valuable. He was the primary capital of the empire, requiring 15 to 20 years to train. A prisoner, however, was a consumable, acquired in a few hours of battle. Therefore, they shifted all risks onto this expendable material. It was this logic, not sadism, that gave rise to human shields and forced prisoners to be the first to storm the walls. In this ledger, the life of one Mongol warrior was worth the lives of hundreds of captives. This practice led directly to turning human bodies into weapons. And now we will see how it worked. The most terrible torture was designed not for the body of the captive, but for the soul of the defender on the wall. The Hashar tactic is simple at first glance. Prisoners from the previously captured city are herded under the walls and forced to carry siege ladders and fill moats. This minimizes losses among Mongol warriors, but the reality was a brutal blow. The primary target was not the prisoners' bodies, but the defenders' will. They were forced to shoot at their own countrymen, neighbors, and sometimes even relatives who were begging for mercy. Every arrow shot became an act of fratricide. This turned the defense of the city into an attempt to extinguish a fire with water in which your own children are drowning. Every life-saving action became an act of murder. But this was not the only way they used people as weapons. They learned to turn them, quite literally, into incendiary projectiles. Persian chronicles describe a tactic that is beyond human comprehension. Captives, especially those dressed in thick clothing, were coated in animal fat, set on fire, and driven towards wooden gates and fortifications. They were living torches. And again, the goal was not the torment of a specific individual, but the maximum psychological effect. A burning, screaming person sows incomparably more panic than a simple flaming arrow. He runs, spreading fire and terror. The defenders on the walls saw not just fire. They saw the running silhouettes of their countrymen, heard their screams, and smelled the scent of burnt flesh mixed with smoke. The key to understanding this horror lay in a paradoxical code of laws that both generated and limited this terror. But the Mongols' most destructive weapons were not swords, but their engineering skills. They were masters of hydro-engineering. They didn't storm walls. They diverted rivers to flood a city or, conversely, cut off its water supply, dooming the inhabitants to death from thirst. Before the Mongol invasion, Merv had a population of up to 500,000 people. After the destruction of the dam on the Murghab River, the city fell into ruins, and it took over 100 years to recover. They were at war not with an army, but with civilization itself. They destroyed what made a city, water, fields, gardens. After a conquest, they often demolished irrigation systems that had been built over centuries. This ensured that civilization would not be reborn there. And this code of laws, the Great Yasa, is the answer to the main question. Was Genghis Khan a sadist or a pragmatist? What is more terrifying, lawless, spontaneous cruelty, or cruelty elevated to the level of state law. The reality of the Mongols proved that the law is more terrifying. Their cruelty was not spontaneous, but systematic, codified in the Great Yasa. If you resisted, your death was not probable, but guaranteed by law. This made the terror inescapable. The law transformed violence from a crime into a duty. A Mongol warrior killing captives was not committing a sin. He was following an order. This absolved him of personal responsibility and made the machine of terror soulless and incredibly effective. Systematic, inescapable, legitimate. It is precisely this conflict between order for their own and terror for others that we will examine in the next chapter. The Great Yasa worked like a double-bladed axe. One of its blades, sharp and ruthless, was turned inward, cutting away any weakness. The other, smooth and polished, faced outward, allowing it to glide over religious matters without resistance. How could a law that punished helping a choking person with death simultaneously establish complete freedom of religion for all conquered peoples? The answer lies in this dual function. The harsh internal laws forged a union of tribes into a monolithic army. But religious tolerance was not humanism. It was pragmatism. By exempting the clergy of all religions from taxes, Genghis Khan bought their loyalty with a single decision and prevented 90% of potential uprisings. It was a hack of the social system, the Yasa's cruelty for internal order, and religious tolerance for external control. But not even the Khan's closest companions were safe from this logic. How did Genghis Khan, a believer in the eternal blue sky, deal with the powerful shaman Teb Tengri who challenged him? At first glance, it was a simple power struggle. The shaman was gaining influence, insulted Genghis Khan's brothers, and the Khan eliminated a rival. But it was not just politics. It was a public declaration of the supremacy of imperial law over spiritual authority. The execution was performed ritually. The shaman's spine was broken so that his sacred blood would not be spilled. This was not anger, but a cold political statement. Genghis Khan showed that no one, not even one who spoke with spirits, stood above the order that ensured the empire's stability. On his command, his younger brother Temüge challenged the shaman to a wrestling match, where 3 wrestlers were already waiting to break his back. This same logic, applied to everyday life, produced laws that seem utterly barbaric to us today. Is it true that the Yasa prescribed death for adultery, even though the Mongols had previously practiced bride kidnapping? Yes. And this seems hypocritical, but bride kidnapping was an ancient tradition that spawned endless intertribal feuds. Genghis Khan banned it on pain of death to unite the tribes. And the execution for adultery strengthened the family as the basic unit of the empire, ensuring stability. This ban was like the painful setting of a dislocated joint. It caused sharp pain to old traditions, but restored the unity of the entire national body. Every law was not sadism, but a tool for achieving unity. But if the system was so logical, where did the most famous myths about torture, like pouring silver down the throat, come from? If torture was unprofitable, where did the image of pouring molten silver into the throat and eyes come from? Such an execution is indeed mentioned in historical sources. It was used on the governor of Otrar, who was responsible for the death of the envoys. This seems to prove their sadism. But there is a nuance. This image was repeatedly propagated by their enemies, the Persian chroniclers who survived the conquest. It was more advantageous for them to portray the Mongols as an irrational evil that reveled in pain. The image of the sadist concealed a terrible truth. Admitting that you were conquered by geniuses of military and psychological warfare was too humiliating. The Persian historian Juvaini, a key source of the Black Legend, wrote his history, The History of the World Conqueror, while in the service of Genghis Khan's grandsons. And now we move on to what the Mongols considered the ultimate form of execution, and it has nothing to do with molten metal. The most famous image of Mongol cruelty is the spark that ignited a global fire of myths, the execution of Inalchuq, the governor of Otrar, into whose eyes and throat molten silver was allegedly poured, became their calling card. And it seems logical, a symbolic punishment for the greed that caused the war. But this single, almost theatrical act, recorded by Juvayni, was inflated to the scale of a system. Persian, and later European, chroniclers turned the exception into the rule. Why? Because it is easier for people to believe in a single monster with a ladle of silver than in a faceless, calculating system that was far more terrifying. The myth of sadism became a convenient screen to hide the truth. Why did the prosperous civilizations of Khwarezm and China so readily believe this myth? The answer lies in the psychology of defeat. To admit that you were crushed, not by a blind horde, but by a hyper-efficient military machine with brilliant strategy and iron discipline, was unbearably humiliating. The image of savage, bloodthirsty barbarians allowed them to explain the catastrophe without acknowledging their own failure. We were not defeated by men, but by a natural disaster, by demons. The myth of sadism is a defense mechanism. It conceals a truth that undermines the foundations of our worldview. That cold, emotionless calculation can be more effective and terrifying than any irrational cruelty. And the key to this calculation lay in their special approach to executing enemy elites. When the first European envoys, Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, reached the heart of the empire, everyone expected them to confirm the most terrible rumors. And they brought them back, stories of ruined cities and mass executions. But it wasn't this that terrified Europe in their reports. They were horrified not by the savagery, but by the monstrous, totalitarian efficiency. They saw not chaos, but iron order, absolute discipline, and a global logistical network against which the fragmented feudal armies were powerless. Plano Carpini was astonished that an order from the Khan in Karakoram was obeyed without question 5,000 kilometers away. Europe did not fear barbarians. It feared an order that was an order of magnitude more advanced than its own, and this order had its own supreme ritualistic form of cruelty. We have dissected the myths and the economics of death. So, what is the ultimate secret of their terror? It lies in shifting the focus from physical pain to total psychological annihilation. The Mongols did not torture the body. They tortured status, faith, and hierarchy. They systematically destroyed the very idea that the nobility, clergy, or sacred symbols were inviolable. Their weapon was aimed at the soul of a civilization. They proved that in the face of their power, all regalia, titles, and divine rights were not just useless, but were targets. And now we move to the culmination, the execution without a single drop of blood, the supreme manifestation of this monstrous doctrine. Why did the Mongols devise an execution for the most powerful enemy, nobility, in which it was strictly forbidden to spill their blood on the ground? This seems absurd. To grant an honorable death to those you hate the most. At first glance, this appears to be a manifestation of ancient steppe beliefs, according to which a person's soul resides in their blood. To spill it on the ground meant offending the spirits and allowing a powerful spirit to seek revenge. But the reality was a brutal blow. This was not an act of respect. It was a way to bypass a sacred taboo, to commit something far worse. The prohibition opened the door to executions that were slow and maximally humiliating. Strangulation, being trampled by horses in a carpet, having one's spine broken. The Mongols hacked the sacred codes of their enemies, formally preserving their honor in order to destroy it in substance. This prohibition worked like an order to hold one's breath. By keeping the soul in the blood, the Mongols turned life itself into an instrument of agonizing torture. And the most monstrous example of this hack occurred after their first encounter with the Rus. What really happened to the Rus' princes after the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223? The fact is well known, but it conceals a diabolical detail. Most chronicles simply state that the princes were crushed. This creates the illusion of a quick and relatively simple execution. But they weren't just crushed. The captured Mstislav of Kiev, his sons-in-law, and other princes were laid down alive under a huge wooden platform. On top, the Mongol commanders, Subutai and Jebe, held a victory feast. The princes died slowly in the darkness, under immense weight, listening to the laughter and celebratory shouts of their conquerors for several hours. This was the ultimate form of ritual humiliation. The Mongols were feasting on the ruins of the old world in the most direct physical sense of the phrase. They were not destroying people, they were destroying status, turning rulers into the foundation for their celebration. For hours, while the feast roared above, the Rus' princes, in complete darkness under the wooden platform, heard only two sounds: the victorious cries of their enemies and the cracking of their own breaking bones. Was the monstrous execution at Khalkha a unique event, born in the heat of battle? At first glance, one might assume it was a demonstrative act to intimidate a new enemy. But the facts refute this theory. Genghis Khan's main rival in unifying the Mongol tribes, his blood brother Jamukha, was executed in exactly the same way. His spine was broken so that his noble blood would not spill on the ground. The same happened to the shaman Teb Tengri. This proves that the execution at Khalkha was not an improvisation, but a refined, systematic practice. The Mongols did not torture the body, they tortured status. For Genghis Khan, there was no difference. Between an external enemy, a prince, and an internal enemy, a brother, anyone who held high status and challenged his authority was subject not just to physical, but to symbolic annihilation. The Great Yasa, which prescribed a bloodless death for the nobility, also punished theft, adultery, and even urinating in water with death. So, what was the central secret of Genghis Khan's empire? The most obvious answer is his unsurpassed military genius. This is logical, but there is a nuance. Genghis Khan's true genius lay in his intuitive understanding of human psychology. He understood a fundamental truth that his opponents ignored. People fear not so much death as humiliation, loss of status, and the destruction of their familiar order. His terror was surgically aimed at these exact pressure points. He built his empire on three fundamental fears: the fear of humiliation, the fear of losing status, and the fear of order being destroyed. Genghis Khan created a system that was both completely predictable, surrender and you will live, and absolutely merciless in its symbolism. Resist and your status will be trampled into the dust. In the final chapter, we will assemble all the pieces of this code of Genghis Khan to see how it functions as a single mechanism. So, the Code of Genghis Khan. It consists of two inseparable parts. The first is the economy of total fear. The demonstrative destruction of Otrar and Khwarazm was not revenge, but the most effective marketing campaign in history. This act instantly crashed the value of resistance and skyrocketed the price of quick surrender for all subsequent cities. Surrendering became not an act of cowardice, but a profitable deal that saved the main asset, the lives of artisans, whom the Mongols used as a resource. The annihilation of over 1 million people in Merv was an investment in fear, equivalent to completely wiping a modern city off the map to force others to surrender without a fight. The Mongols managed not people, but resources, and fear was the tool that turned enemies into assets. But this economy worked externally. Internally, It was protected by the second element of the code. This second element is the great yasa as a justification for external terror. The cruelty towards captives was the flip side of the care for their own warriors. The yasa punished cowardice or abandoning a comrade with death, making a Mongol's life the highest value within the system. Therefore, the Haishar tactic, the human shield of prisoners, was not sadism, but logical resource management. The captives were the cheap wooden handle for an expensive steel blade. They were the consumable material that absorbed all the blows to preserve the precious blade. The Mongol warrior, the absolute internal order, cemented by the yasa, made it possible to apply absolute external terror. One was impossible without the other. But having understood how the system worked, we return to the main question: why do we prefer to ignore this systematic nature in favor of myths about simple sadism? Because we instinctively cling to the myth of pouring molten silver, but we fear the reality of the feast on the bones. Vivid emotional sadism allows us to attribute everything to madness, to barbarism, to an inhuman nature. It is a comfortable lie that places the Mongols outside the framework of our world and makes their phenomenon explainable. The truth is far more terrifying. It is that Subutai, the genius who ordered the feast on the bones, was known not for sadism, but for cold military efficiency. The Mongol machine of terror was not insane, but rational. Its cruelty was not an explosion of passion, but the smooth operation of a mechanism. To admit this is to admit that the most monstrous cruelty in history can be born not from hatred, but from logic. This is the code of Genghis Khan. We have traveled the entire path from myth to reality. We have cracked this code. And now, at the very end, one final, most important question remains, which we want to ask you personally. After everything you have learned, what frightens you more, a crazed, sadistic maniac who enjoys the pain of others, or an emotionless, systematic administrator of genocide who acts strictly according to instructions and calculations? We ask you not to write long comments. Just answer with a single word that reflects your primary fear. Write in the comments, maniac or system. Let's see which of us there are more of. This choice says as much about us as it does about Genghis Khan. Thank you for watching.